Okay, so we're going to pick back up with population biology, now talking about reproductive strategies. So this is related to how quickly basically organisms can reproduce. And we can generally group organisms into one of these two reproductive strategies. Now, there are organisms that are going to fall in between these two because, nature doesn't like us being, putting them in boxes. But we can generally put a lot of organisms into either what we call R-selected species or K-selected species. And R is talking about basically that they're reproducing quickly. K-selected species, meaning that they are going to reproduce slower. So let's take a look at some of these look at this strategy and some of the characteristics that come along with it. So R-selected species, they are going to generally have a short lifespan. So they're not going to live very long. We're talking, hours to maybe a couple of years. Because they have that short lifespan, they're going to have to grow quickly and mature early. So they're going to have to be able to reproduce very early in their lifespan. So we're talking about like mice. Mice are able to reproduce after only a couple of months after they're born. And they grow very quickly. If you've ever seen a baby mouse, they start off very tiny, but very quickly they turn into full-size mice. They're going to have many small offspring. So they're not going to have just one or two. We're talking about litters or thousands of offspring. So think about like fish and trees and things like that. Little parental care or protection. So something like a mouse is going to give more parental care than most of the R-selected species. So again, think like fish or trees, right? They basically go, all right, have fun. And they don't come back. So they lay their eggs or they drop the seeds and they're gone. Same with investment. So they're not going to pack up a lot of energy or material with those offspring. The eggs aren't going to be very big. Think about like a fish egg versus a bird's egg, right? A bird's egg is going to be bigger. It's going to have the yolk and all of the material in it. Fish eggs are very small. Not a lot of material there to help feed that baby fish. These guys, though, have an advantage. They are going to be adapted to unstable environments. So, if things are changing quickly, temperatures, moisture, all of those sort of things, that works very well for these guys, mainly because they have these short lifespans. They can mutate quickly and use natural selection to their advantage. So therefore, they are generally going to be pioneers. They're whenever there's a disturbance, they're going to be some of the first ones there. So some of these sometimes for plants are considered weeds. They're called niche generalists. So what are we talking about? Niche. This is kind of a combination of habitat, but all the other characteristics that we use to describe where we find organisms. So that's going to be what kind of soil they need if they're a plant, what kind of temperatures do they like, what kind of moisture do they need, what kind of food do they eat if they are any sort of consumer. But they're going to be generalists. They're not going to be very picky about what they need or like. They are generally food for other organisms. So these are generally smaller organisms. If they're bigger like trees, they're still generally going to be eaten by other organisms. And they're mainly going to be regulated by extrinsic or outside factors. So things like abiotic factors. And they're going to be low on the trophic level. So again, they're food, so they're going to be low on that pyramid. So there, we've got the producers with the plants, and then we've got the herbivores, right? So we're going up, and so we've got, I don't know, a cow. No, not a cow. Let's do my very bad rendition of a bug. All right, and then we've got a bird, not very great with the drawing. All right. So these guys are going to be generally down here, right? Okay. And if you look now at the K-selected species, they're pretty much the opposite of the R-selected species, right? Almost every single one of those is the opposite of an R-selected species. So what do you think might be an example of a K-selected species? So R-selected species, I've been giving you some examples of those. So those would be things like if it's an animal like an insect or a fish. But what would be an example of a K-selected species? So you may have put down humans. Humans are definitely K-selected, right? I mean, our maturity before we start reproducing isn't until usually about 13, 14 years before we're able to start reproducing. Slower growth, definitely. We start off as infants who aren't able to do anything. And again, it takes us a couple of years before we're even able to move around by ourselves efficiently. And we can't even really feed ourselves for those, first 4 or 5 years. So we are definitely K-selected. A lot of larger organisms are K-selected. So think of things like elephants. My brain just blanked out. Bears, and a lot of the big predators. So tigers, things like that. So you can also see, though, why there would be animals that would fall in the middle here. So like, where would you put a bird? Because birds are in between. Birds don't have a high parental care investment, but they do spend more time with their offspring than, say, a fish. So this is a good way to start separating out organisms, but it's not perfect. Now, another way that you can kind of put these guys into groups, as you saw, was lifespan. The thing is, though, is that lifespans vary, especially maximum lifespans. So we've got everything from one of the longest lived organisms on the planet, and that's this guy over here. These are Bristlecone Pines. They've been dated up to 4,900 years old. And no, they're not telling anybody where that one is. But you can count the rings on these guys in order to determine their age. You can see how big they are. They're not super huge. I mean, these people are probably around 6 feet tall. So they're not super huge, but they grow super slow. They're found up in high mountain ranges. Where it's cold, so they grow very slowly. Versus humans, our maximum lifespan is about 120 years right now. Then you've got elephants. I mean, elephants are bigger than humans, so you'd think, oh, big animal, bigger than us, maybe bigger lifespan. Nope, they've got a lifespan of about 70 years for maximum. Eastern box turtles, these little guys that are found here in Ohio, which I just think are super cute, as well as got very pretty shell. By the way, if you find one, please leave it where you found it. Unless it's on a road, then help it, go the direction it was going. But these guys live 50 plus years. We know that some of them live up to 100 years, right? And so these little organisms can live for a very long time, almost as long as a human. Versus microbes. Microbes can live hours, maybe days at most. So, very wide variety of maximum lifespans. And the thing is that something like a box turtle has a hard time fitting into those R and K reproductive strategies we were just talking about, because box turtles lay their eggs, they lay a decent number of eggs, and they leave them. So they have no parental care, but yet they have long lifespans. And they're not big in size. They can be prey for other organisms. So it does make it difficult to put them in one of those categories. So how else might we be able to put organisms into some categories to help us sort them out? Well, something else we can look at is survivorship curves. So there is a continuum again, so you can actually put organisms in between these, but you can at least start to pull them towards one or the other of these three lines. So these survivorship curves, what you're looking at is the y-axis is, in this case, the logarithm of survivorship. But it doesn't matter if it's log or not. Basically, what you're looking at here at the beginning, pretty much all of the organisms are alive. So we're starting with everybody alive, and at the end, everybody's dead. I know that sounds really depressing, but that's what we're looking at. Everybody's alive, everybody's dead. And the important part is what happens in between. So we're going to take a look at this one first. So this is a survivor curve of a type 1. So it's labeled A. So we're looking first at the dependency period. So this is when you're basically an offspring, right? When you're growing. And you can see for type 1, it's high survivorship here. And that's because you're depending on your parents, right? Whatever organism you are, you're depending on your parents to help you survive. Then reproductive period, still pretty high survivorship for type 1. And that goes on until you get to post-reproductive period. And then that's when survivorship drops off pretty quickly. So what kinds of organisms are type 1s? Well, mostly those K type organisms. So organisms like elephants, ourselves. These are organisms that give a lot of care to their offspring. So that's what allows them to survive through their dependency period. They're also organisms that have very few offspring and are generally larger organisms. So type 1 are going to definitely tend towards K. So type 1 is pretty much those K-selected organisms. We're going to jump down here to C. This is, I'm hoping it's not going to be a surprise, going to be called a type 3 curve. And this one is a type 2. Whoop, there we go. So we're going to look at type 3 next. Type 3 is basically the opposite of type 1. So type 3, what happens to the offspring in the dependency period? The dependency period, large number of them die. And why do they die off? Because they're not being taken care of. Yeah. So organisms that are following a type 3 curve are not going to give any real care to their offspring. And they're going to have a large number of them because of that. Because this is happening, so they have to have lots and lots of offspring in order to ensure that some of them make it to the reproductive period. Then at the reproductive period, survivorship levels off all the way through until the end of the post-reproductive period when those survivors die off. But you can see that the survivorship is very low once you get to the end of the dependency period. So we've got, in this case, R-selected organisms. So this is going to be things like, so these trees are R-selected. I'm going to put a K with the 1. So these guys are 3s, right? So even though trees are big, they are food, right? And they're going to produce tons of offspring because they don't put any energy or care into their offspring once they let them go as seeds. Survivorship curves then actually give us a third option. This is the in-between of K and R. So survivorship curve number 2 is going to be any of those organisms that land in between. So we've got pretty much an equal chance of surviving if you're number 2 through all of the periods. So whether you're an offspring, you're in your reproductive period, or post-reproductive period, you have a 50-50 chance of surviving. And this is because as an offspring, your parents are going to give you some care, but not necessarily care through your entire childhood. Then during your reproductive period, you are in that in-between place. You can be a predator, but you can also be food. So hence why you're more likely to get eaten, less likely to survive, all the way through your post-reproductive period. And so that's why we've got the seagull over here. This is something like a bird or cats, dogs, those guys that would fit in between.